Why was Commander Harlan Voss staring at the young medic like she didn't belong there? 3 days before anyone's life depended on her, the question hung in the air of a quiet briefing room that smelled of old coffee and metal equipment. Tessa Cole sat at the end of the table, small, silent, her pack resting against the chair beside her. Across the room, Mitch Kowalski leaned back with the relaxed confidence of a man who had spent decades proving himself right. "You're a SEAL medic?" he asked. It wasn't curiosity, it was judgment dressed like a question. Tessa didn't answer immediately. She looked at him calmly, as if weighing how much of herself this moment deserved. "Corpsman, IDC certified." Kowalski smirked slightly. "They sent us somebody's kid sister." A few quiet seconds passed. Tessa simply turned back to the mission map. No argument. No defense. Just silence. From the corner of the room, Chief Everett Dawes watched her carefully. Old soldiers learned to read reactions the way hunters read tracks. And what he saw wasn't embarrassment. It was patience. Commander Voss noticed it too. He had seen hundreds of operators walk into rooms like this. Some tried to prove themselves immediately. Some bristled at doubt. Some shrank under it. But this young medic, she absorbed it like it didn't matter. That unsettled him more than if she had fought back. Because Voss carried something heavy from another mission, 3 years earlier. A young man named Merritt had died on a stretcher 40 meters from an extraction zone. The medic assigned to that operation hadn't been ready. And Voss had approved him. That mistake had never left him. So when Washington assigned a 26-year-old corpsman to this Tier 1 operation, he didn't argue. But he didn't trust it either. Not yet. That night, the team moved through cold forest under a moon that hid behind clouds. 5 shadows slipping through trees. Tessa walked near the rear, watching everything. Not casually. Precisely. She noticed Finch's breathing pattern long before anyone else would have. At first it was subtle, too fast for the pace they were keeping. She stepped beside him quietly. "Stop." Finch blinked. "What?" "Turn around." Her kit was already open. Pulse, eyes, skin tone. Within seconds, she started an IV and adjusted the weight of his pack. "Electrolyte imbalance," she said softly. "You're dehydrating." The whole process took 4 minutes. Finch felt embarrassed. But he felt better. Much better. What he didn't realize was that those 4 minutes kept him from collapsing later during a critical movement. From 10 feet away, Voss watched everything without speaking. He filed it away quietly. The next morning brought the second moment. This time it was Kowalski. He reached across his body while adjusting gear. A tiny motion. No one noticed. Except Tessa. "Your left shoulder," she said calmly. Kowalski looked annoyed. "What about it?" "Rotator cuff surgery, 6 or 7 years ago." He froze. "Did someone brief you on my file?" "No." "Then how do you know?" "Because you compensate when you reach." Silence. Then she stepped forward. "Let me fix your sling." He didn't say yes. But he didn't say no either. In under a minute, she redistributed the load across his rig in a way that relieved pressure on the joint without slowing his draw. Kowalski tested it. Once. Twice. He said nothing. But that night he didn't call her kid sister again. Chief Dawes approached her later while she checked her equipment under dim light. "You watch ground like a field operator," he said. "My father taught me." "Military. Force recon." Dawes nodded slowly. That explained something. At the bottom of her kit sat a single .30 caliber round tied to paracord. She held it briefly before closing the pouch. A quiet ritual. the kind soldiers carry without explanation. At 1:30, the intelligence update arrived. And everything changed. The target group had accelerated their schedule. 8 hours earlier than expected. The mission window shrank instantly. Voss adjusted the plan in 4 minutes. Harder insertion, less cover. Higher risk. He studied the team's reactions carefully. No panic. Just quiet acceptance. Then he looked at Tessa. She met his gaze calmly. No fear. No hesitation. Just readiness. They moved out at 200. The valley appeared slowly beneath them as the trees thinned. And something was wrong. More vehicles than expected. More people. Voss counted at least 14 armed personnel. And then he saw the bigger problem. A ridge to the east. And on that ridge, a sniper. Kowalski raised his Barrett .50 and checked the scope. Then lowered it. His right hand trembled slightly. At 840 meters, that tremor meant a miss. And a miss meant the entire operation collapsing. Voss looked at the shaking hand. Then at Tessa. She was already looking at the rifle. Some decisions happen before words exist. She moved toward the Barrett. Cole, Voss said carefully. She crouched beside the rifle. I know the distance. 3 seconds passed. 3 very long seconds. Then Voss nodded. Tessa adjusted the rifle stock for her smaller frame. The world shrank to the scope. 840 meters. Wind shifting from the north. Her father's voice echoed somewhere deep in memory. Breathe, let the shot happen between heartbeats. She squeezed the trigger. The Barrett thundered across the valley. The bullet struck 2 inches left. A miss. The sniper rolled for cover. 20 seconds before he disappeared. The team froze. Everything balanced on this moment. Tessa didn't look at anyone. She reacquired the target. The wind settled. Her pulse slowed. The still point. Another breath. Another squeeze. The second shot cracked the night open. The silhouette on the ridge went still. 840 meters. Absolute silence behind her. Then Kowalski whispered something that wasn't quite a word. Tessa stood calmly, picked up her medical kit, and walked to Voss. Let me see your shoulder. Only then did anyone fully realize something. The quiet medic they had doubted had just saved the mission. But the real test hadn't even begun. Because 2 nights later, in the middle of a firefight, Commander Harlan Voss would be bleeding out in the dirt. And the only thing standing between him and death would be the same young medic everyone had underestimated. Why did the shot sound different when it struck flesh instead of rock? Tessa Cole heard the answer before she fully understood what had happened. The firefight erupted suddenly during the extraction route. 2 kilometers from the pickup point, the forest exploded with gunfire from the east tree line. The team hit the ground instantly. Training took over before thought could catch up. Tessa slid behind a rock formation, clutching her medical kit against her chest as rounds cracked through branches above them. She scanned the team. Finch returning fire behind a fallen tree. Kowalski shifting through the drainage ditch to flank. Dawes vanished into the trees to the east. Then she saw Voss. 3 steps into open ground. And then the shot. His body jerked sharply before collapsing. For a fraction of a second, the world seemed to stop. Then Tessa moved. Low and fast across frozen ground. By the time she reached him, his hands were already pressed against his chest. Blood seeped through his fingers. Entry wound just below the clavicle. Breathing uneven. She pushed his hands aside. Her mind narrowed instantly. Hemothorax. blood filling the chest cavity. 6 minutes before the lung collapsed. Maybe less. Gunfire continued around them, but it became distant noise in her mind. Patient. Procedure. Time. Her left hand was injured from the previous night, the deep cut reopening as she worked. She ignored it. Needle decompression. Second intercostal space. She located it by touch. The needle slid between ribs. A small hiss escaped as trapped air released. The most beautiful sound she had heard all night. Breathe with me, sir. Voss watched her closely. Not panicked. Just measuring. She placed the chest seal next. Gunfire snapped closer from the east. Someone was advancing. Finch's rifle shifted rhythm. He couldn't cover the angle completely. Tessa didn't hesitate. Her left hand grabbed her sig. The wrong hand. The injured hand. 2 quick shots toward the movement. Not perfect aim. Just enough disruption. Finch corrected the angle and finished the job. She returned to Voss immediately. Seal secured. Pulse steadying. Breathing improving. He would live. But Voss kept staring at her with an expression she would remember long after the mission ended. The look of a man realizing he had been profoundly wrong. Minutes later, the firefight ended. The helicopter arrived 19 minutes after the call. Tessa delivered the medical handoff calmly and precisely. When they lifted Voss onto the litter, he stopped the flight medic with a raised hand. Cole. She stepped closer. Rotors thundered overhead. I owe you the truth, he said loudly enough for the team to hear. I judged you before you ever walked in that room. Silence filled the clearing. What you did tonight, he paused. I've seen a lot in 30 years. His eyes locked on hers. You belong here. Kowalski stood straighter beside them. Finch nodded once. Dawes said nothing, which meant he agreed completely. The helicopter lifted moments later, carrying Voss into the night sky. Tessa stood in the clearing long after it vanished. No one spoke. Some moments don't need words. They simply settle into memory. 6 months later, in a quiet classroom in Coronado, 14 young trainees stared at the woman writing 4 words on a whiteboard. Drag them out alive. One recruit raised his hand carefully. Ma'am, is it true you made the 1,180-meter shot? Tessa paused. Yes. He hesitated before asking the real question. So you're a SEAL medic? She looked at him calmly, the same way she had looked at Kowalski months earlier. Corpsman, she said. IDC certified. But now there was no smirk in the room. Only respect. Because sometimes strength isn't loud. Sometimes it doesn't argue. Sometimes it simply waits. And when the moment comes, it acts. Quietly. Precisely. And when the smoke clears, the world finally understands what was standing in front of it all along. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply saves lives. What kind of medic misses a shot and still saves the mission? The question hung silently in the minds of every man on that ridge after the thunder of the Barrett faded into the night. Tessa Cole didn't ask it. She already knew the answer. She sat back on her heels, the rifle still warm beneath her hands, the smell of burned powder drifting through the cold air. 840 meters away, the ridge had gone quiet again. The sniper she had struck wasn't moving. Behind her, the team remained frozen in place for a moment longer. Not from fear. From recalculation. Kowalski slowly lowered his binoculars. For years that Barrett rifle had been an extension of his own body. He trusted few people with it. He trusted none of them with it 5 minutes ago. Now he was looking at the young medic like she had just rewritten a rule he'd believed his entire career. "You said you missed," Finch murmured quietly. Tessa didn't look back. "I did." Finch shook his head slowly, almost smiling. "Yeah, but you also fixed it." But Tessa wasn't thinking about the shot anymore. Her eyes were already moving across the valley floor. Patterns, movement, vehicles parked at angles that suggested urgency instead of preparation. The handoff had already started. Commander Voss lowered the binoculars and made his decision. "We move." The descent into the valley took 11 careful minutes. Every step placed deliberately. Every branch avoided. In operations like this, silence wasn't just discipline. It was survival. Tessa stayed near the rear of the column, scanning the ridgelines the way her father had taught her years ago in the wide, open fields of Montana. Not looking at things, looking between them. That subtle difference had saved her more than once. The structure at the center of the valley was smaller than the satellite photos had suggested. A low concrete building surrounded by 3 trucks and a pair of SUVs. 14 armed men. Maybe 15. Voss raised 2 fingers. Split entry. The team moved like shadows across frozen ground. The first contact happened near the vehicles. Quick. Controlled. Precise. No shouting. No chaos. Just the quiet violence of professionals finishing a job. By the time the last man dropped his rifle, the valley had fallen silent again. Tessa was already moving among the team. Checking pulses. Scanning for injuries. Her hands worked quickly, automatically, like someone solving a puzzle she had solved 100 times before. Finch leaned against the wall of the structure, breathing heavily. "You always this calm?" he asked. She glanced up briefly. "No." He laughed softly. "You hide it well." But the mission wasn't over yet. Far from it. They spent the next hour gathering intelligence, documenting equipment, and preparing the site for extraction. The eastern horizon was just beginning to soften with the faintest hint of gray when they pulled away from the valley. That's when the second problem arrived. The intelligence update came through a secure channel at 4:30. Voss read the message once, then again, and the expression on his face told the team everything they needed to know. "This operation isn't finished," he said quietly. Another convoy had linked with the original group, and the equipment they had come to intercept was still moving north, 11 kilometers away. 6 hours before it vanished into a supply chain that would take months to trace again. The team looked exhausted. Because they were. 2 days of near-constant movement. Minimal sleep. Adrenaline wearing thin. But none of them complained. Voss studied the terrain map spread across a flat rock. "There's one place we can stop them," he said. A ridge overlooking the exchange corridor. Long sightline. Minimal cover. Distance, 1,180 meters. Kowalski let out a slow breath. "That's a hell of a shot." He looked down at his hand. The tremor was still there. Not dramatic, but enough. At that distance, enough meant failure. He looked at Tessa, and for the first time since the mission began, there was no skepticism in his eyes. Just a simple question. "Can you make it?" Tessa had been watching the ridge for several minutes already. Calculating wind, temperature, elevation. She flexed her left hand slowly. The cut from the night before had reopened during the descent. Blood had soaked through the dressing. She closed her fist. Pain. Manageable. She looked back at the ridge. "Yes." Kowalski handed her the Barrett. No ceremony, but the gesture carried weight. The approach to the firing position took 40 minutes through brutal terrain. Loose shale, icy creek crossings, cold water that stiffened Tessa's injured hand for 10 long seconds before feeling returned. She forced the fingers open and closed again as they moved. Pain was information. Nothing more. The ridge crest offered a shallow depression perfect for concealment. She settled behind the rifle. Voss knelt beside her with binoculars. Dawes took security 10 feet back. 7 minutes, Voss said quietly. That was the window. 7 minutes before the convoy disappeared behind terrain that would shield them completely. Through the scope, the road looked impossibly far away. A narrow ribbon winding through pale winter grass. The vehicles appeared small, almost harmless, but the equipment they carried was. Tessa adjusted the bipod. The stock was still configured for Kowalski's frame. She shortened it again. Her injured hand struggled to grip the forend properly. So she changed technique. Forearm pressed against the bipod leg. Not textbook, but stable. Her father's voice returned again, steady as ever. The long shot isn't about confidence. Confidence is for people trying to convince themselves. The long shot is about acceptance. Accept the distance. Accept the wind. Accept that once the bullet leaves the barrel, the rest belongs to physics. The convoy appeared in the scope. 3 vehicles. Moving steadily. Voss watched through binoculars. Second vehicle, he said. The one carrying the cargo. Wind drift from the northwest. Subtle cross current at mid-range. She built the solution carefully in her mind. Her pulse slowed. The still point. She squeezed the trigger. The Barrett roared across the ridge. Through the scope she saw the lead vehicle swerve violently. The second vehicle stopped moving entirely. The exchange corridor was finished. For several seconds no one spoke. Then Dawes exhaled softly. That's not just math. Tessa didn't respond. She simply lifted her head from the scope and checked the valley again. Mission complete. Or so it seemed. Because sometimes the most dangerous part of a mission is the walk home. The team began the 6-kilometer trek toward extraction. Fatigue had settled into their bones now. The quiet exhaustion that follows intense focus. Tessa walked second from the rear again, watching the ridges behind them. Her injured hand throbbed with each step. But there was a hierarchy to injuries. And hers ranked low. They were 2 kilometers from the extraction point when the forest erupted. A crack from the eastern tree line. Then another. Then a storm of gunfire. Ambush. Perfectly timed. The enemy had predicted their route. The team dropped instantly. Rocks. Trees. Anything solid. Rounds chewed through branches overhead. Tessa slid behind a low rock outcrop and pulled her medical kit close. Her first check was always the same. Self. Then team. Finch alive. Returning fire. Kowalski moving to flank through a drainage cut. Dawes already disappearing into the eastern trees. Then she saw Voss at the front of the column. And for 3 seconds, everything looked manageable. Then the third firing position opened from the north. A trap. Designed to push them into a kill zone. Voss broke cover to establish a firing angle. 3 steps into open ground. The shot hit him before he reached it. Tessa heard the sound of the impact before she understood what it meant. And in that instant, everything changed. Because now the mission didn't matter anymore. Now it was about keeping one man alive. And Tessa Cole was the only person there who could do it. But saving him would mean something else too. something she had avoided for 11 years. Because in the next few seconds, the promise she made to her mother was about to break. Why did the promise break in the exact moment it mattered most? Tessa Cole would remember that question long after the gunfire faded. Because promises sound simple when they are spoken in quiet rooms. They become something else entirely when bullets are moving through trees. The ambush erupted from 3 directions: east, north, and somewhere deeper in the forest where sound bounced between trunks and made distance impossible to judge. The team hit the ground immediately. Training replaced thought. Finch rolled behind a fallen tree and returned controlled bursts toward the eastern tree line. Kowalski vanished into the drainage channel, working his way toward a flanking angle. Dawes was already gone. The man moved through combat the way smoke moves through a room, silent, impossible to follow, suddenly appearing where he needed to be. And in the center of it all lay Commander Harlan Voss. Flat on his back, blood spreading across the front of his vest. Tessa reached him before she consciously remembered moving. The world shrank to a circle of ground between her knees and his chest. "Sir, look at me." His hands were pressed hard against his right side. She pulled them away. Entry wound high on the chest wall, just below the clavicle. Blood. Too much blood. His breathing was wrong, too. Left lung expanding normally. Right side struggling. Her brain finished the calculation in seconds. Hemothorax. Blood collecting inside the chest cavity, crushing the lung from the outside. 6 minutes before respiratory collapse. Maybe less. The firefight around them continued, but it became background noise. Her mind did something it had learned to do years ago. It narrowed. Patient. Procedure. Time. Her left hand was still cut from the previous night, the bandage already soaked through. The grip strength wasn't there. So she changed the way she worked. Her right hand opened the medical kit. Needle decompression. 14 gauge. She found the landmark by touch. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The light was too poor to see clearly. So she trusted her training. The needle slid between the ribs. A soft hiss escaped. Air releasing from a space where it didn't belong. The right lung expanded slightly. Not perfect, but better. "Breathe with me," she said calmly. Voss's eyes stayed locked on her face. He wasn't panicking. He was measuring. That was the thing about experienced operators. They read other people's expressions to understand how bad their situation really was. So she kept her own expression controlled. Serious, but steady. No panic. Her fingers moved to the chest seal. 40 seconds. That's all she had. Gunfire cracked closer from the eastern tree line. Too close. Someone was advancing. Finch heard it too. His rifle fire shifted from suppression to precision. But his angle left a gap. A narrow approach corridor that neither of them could fully see. Tessa knew exactly what that meant. If someone pushed through that gap now, they would reach her and Voss before Finch could stop them. Her right hand pressed the chest seal against the wound. Her left hand moved automatically toward her sidearm. The motion paused halfway. Because for 11 years she had carried a promise. A promise made to her mother the day after her father's funeral. Her mother's voice returned now with painful clarity. "Don't pick up a gun to kill someone. Serve if you need to. Heal if you can. But I can't lose you the way I lost him." For 11 years Tessa had honored that promise. 3 deployments. Dozens of firefights nearby. But never once had she fired a weapon at another human being. until the ridge, until the Barrett. And now this moment. Another shape moved between trees. Closer. Too close. Finch fired again, but the angle was wrong. If the attacker reached 10 more feet, Voss would die. The promise broke quietly. Not with drama. Not with anger. Just with acceptance. Tessa drew her sig with her injured left hand. The grip was unstable. Her fingers slick with blood. But she didn't hesitate. 2 quick shots toward the moving shadow. Not perfect aim. Just disruption. The advancing figure dropped low instinctively. That tiny pause gave Finch exactly the opening he needed. His rifle barked once. Then the forest went still again. Tessa reholstered the pistol immediately. Her focus snapped back to Voss. Chest seal placed. Adhesion checked. Pulse rapid but strong. Breathing improving. The 6-minute clock slowed. He was going to live. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Voss just looked at her. Really looked. Like he was seeing something clearly for the first time. Around them, the firefight shifted. Gunfire from the east suddenly stopped. Kowalski had completed his flank. A moment later, Dawes emerged from the northern tree line like he had always been there. The ambush collapsed. Silence returned slowly to the forest. Tessa kept her hands on Voss's chest, counting breaths. 1, 2, 3, each one stronger than the last. Only then did she sit back slightly. Finch crossed the ground toward them, breathing hard. He looked down at Voss. Then at the dressing. Then at Tessa. You got him? He asked quietly. Yes. Finch nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. 19 minutes later, the helicopter arrived. The sound reached them long before the aircraft appeared. Rotors beating the air somewhere beyond the ridge. The flight medic jumped down as the team prepared the litter. He was young. Younger than Tessa expected. But his eyes sharpened immediately when she began her report. GSW right upper chest, she said. Needle decompression performed in field. Chest seal applied. Breathing stabilized but monitor for reaccumulation. Every word precise. Every detail necessary. The medic listened carefully. When she finished, he looked at her again. You did the decompression out here? Yes. Under fire. She glanced briefly at the surrounding forest. There was some fire. The medic nodded slowly. Respect replaced curiosity. They lifted Voss onto the litter. But before they loaded him onto the helicopter, he raised a hand weakly. Cole. The rotors thundered louder now. She stepped closer. He struggled onto one elbow despite the medic's protest. There were things he needed to say. And some things had to be said in front of witnesses. I owe you the truth, he said. Kowalski and Finch stood nearby. Dawes watched from the tree line. Voss's voice was rough but steady. I walked into this mission carrying something that wasn't yours to carry. Tessa waited silently. 3 years ago, a man died because I trusted the wrong medic. His eyes held hers. And I decided I wouldn't make that mistake again. A pause. So when they assigned you, I judged you before you ever walked in the door. The helicopter wind whipped through the clearing now. Leaves spinning across the ground. That was wrong, he said. He took a slow breath. What you did tonight, I've seen a lot in 30 years. His voice softened slightly. But I've never seen that. He looked around at the others. You belong here. Kowalski straightened instinctively. Finch nodded once. Dawes didn't say anything. But the way he stood said enough. The flight medic finally intervened. "Sir, we have to go." Voss allowed himself to be lowered back onto the stretcher. But before the litter was lifted, he looked at Tessa one last time. "Call your mother," he said. "When this is done." The helicopter lifted into the cold night. The sound of the rotors grew smaller, then vanished completely. Tessa remained standing in the clearing long after it disappeared. No one rushed her. Some moments needed space. Eventually, Kowalski slung his rifle over his shoulder. "Secondary shelter," he said quietly. 3 kilometers. The team began moving again. Tessa followed last. And as they walked through the dark forest, something had changed. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just a different kind of silence. The silence of people who now knew exactly who they were walking with. 3 kilometers later, they reached an abandoned ranger station. 4 walls, a wood stove, and the rare luxury of a roof. Inside, the team finally stopped moving. Tessa sat against the eastern wall and began stitching the cut on her own hand. The needle moved steadily through skin. Kowalski watched her for a long moment. Then he stepped forward. "Cole." She looked up. For a second, the big man seemed uncomfortable. Apologies weren't something he practiced often. "I was wrong," he said plainly. "From the minute you walked into that briefing room. No excuses. No softening. Just the truth. And I said things that weren't fair." He glanced around at the others. "So I'm saying it here." Tessa studied him for a moment. Not angry. Not forgiving either. Just acknowledging the honesty. She nodded once. "Okay." Kowalski nodded back and sat down across the room. The matter was finished. Simple. Honest. Enough. But later that night, when the others slept and the wind moved softly through the trees outside, Tessa sat alone by the window, thinking about the promise she had broken and the phone call she still had to make. Why is it harder to face the people we love than the enemies trying to kill us? Tessa Cole thought about that question long after the ranger station had gone quiet. The others were asleep or close to it. Kowalski leaned against the far wall, his rifle across his chest. Finch had stretched out on the wooden floor near the stove, already drifting somewhere between exhaustion and sleep. Dawes sat near the door, not quite resting, not quite watching, just existing in that calm half-state old operators learned to live in. Outside, the forest had settled back into its slow rhythm. Wind moving through pine branches. Cold pressing against the windows. And somewhere in the distance, the quiet sound of a river running under ice. Tessa sat alone near the small window. Her left hand rested in her lap, the fresh stitches pulling slightly every time she flexed her fingers. She had done the work carefully, methodically, the way she would treat any other patient. But now the room was quiet enough for other things to surface. Memories. Her mother's voice. "Don't pick up a gun to kill someone." The promise had lived with her for 11 years. Since the morning 2 Marines had stood on their porch in Montana. Since the folded flag. Since the silence that followed. Her father had taught her how to shoot long before that day. Saturday mornings before sunrise, driving out to open fields with frost still clinging to the grass. He had believed in patience more than talent. "Don't fight the rifle," he used to say. "Let it be part of you." But after he died, her mother had asked for something simple. Not a demand. Not an order. Just a request born from grief. And Tessa had honored it. Until the valley. Until the ridge. Until tonight. She looked down at her hands. Both of them. The same hands that had placed a needle into a dying man's chest. the same hands that had fired a pistol into darkness. Heal when you can. Fight when you must. Her father would have understood that balance. Her mother might not. Across the room, Dawes spoke quietly without looking up. "You're thinking about the call." Tessa glanced over. "How do you know?" He shrugged slightly. "Because I had one like it once." That was all he said. He didn't offer advice. Didn't try to soften it. Some things couldn't be softened. Tessa nodded once. Outside, the sky slowly began to lighten. Morning arriving in slow gray layers over the mountains. And somewhere beyond the forest, a helicopter would soon come to collect them. But the call would still be waiting. Morning came quietly to the ranger station. Kowalski was the first one on his feet. He stretched slowly, rolling tension out of shoulders that had carried too many years of equipment and responsibility. Finch followed soon after, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "You ever notice," he muttered, "that the worst missions always end with the longest walks?" "No," Kowalski replied dryly. "Because the worst ones don't end." Finch thought about that, then nodded. "Fair point." Tessa had already packed her kit. The same careful ritual she performed before every movement. Tourniquet, chest seals, IV kit, needle decompression. Everything in its place. Preparation wasn't just organization. It was a quiet promise. "I am ready." Extraction arrived mid-morning. A single helicopter cutting low across the treetops. The pilot didn't waste time. Neither did the team. Within minutes they were airborne. As the forest dropped away beneath them, Finch leaned across the cabin toward Tessa. "You ever realize," he said quietly, "you saved my life twice this week?" She looked at him. "Twice?" He nodded. "Trail dehydration the first night." Then he gestured vaguely toward the forest they had left behind. "And everything after that." Tessa didn't answer. Some debts didn't need acknowledgement. Across from them, Kowalski watched quietly. Then he spoke. "You know what the weird part is?" Finch raised an eyebrow. "What?" "The weird part," Kowalski said slowly, "is that I'm not surprised anymore." 6 months passed. October arrived along the California coast with cool mornings and low gray clouds rolling in from the Pacific. Naval Amphibious Base Coronado moved with its usual rhythm. Boots on pavement. Orders called across training fields. Helicopters passing overhead at irregular intervals. Tessa parked her car near the training facility and sat for a moment before stepping out. Not from hesitation. From habit. A brief pause to take inventory of herself before entering a room. She had gained back the weight the mission had taken from her. The cut on her left hand had healed into a thin white scar. She had considered covering it, but decided not to. Scars were records, and she had no interest in rewriting the record. Inside the classroom, 14 trainees sat waiting. Some looked confident, some nervous, all of them curious. In the third row, a young recruit named Colt Hargrove leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her with open skepticism. 22 years old. Good posture. The quiet confidence of someone who had been told his whole life he was capable, but who had not yet discovered where his limits lived. Tessa walked to the board. She wrote 4 words. Drag them out alive. Then she turned to face the room. "This program is called Integrated Combat Medicine," she said. "You will hear it referred to by its acronym. I prefer the full name." She paused. "Because the full name explains the job." 14 faces watched her carefully now. "You were selected because you are good at part of your job." She let the sentence sit in the air for a moment. Some of you are excellent. Another pause. That's not enough. No one spoke. Because someday, she continued calmly, the person you need to keep alive will be on one side of you. She lifted her left hand slightly. And the thing trying to kill them will be on the other. Her eyes moved slowly across the room. You won't get to choose which hand to use. Hargrove leaned forward slightly now. Listening. You've been trained to heal, she said. That training matters, but it isn't complete. She folded her hands together. Heal when you can. Then she separated them again. Fight when you must. The room was silent. And when the moment comes when you have to do both at the same time, you don't freeze. She paused. You find the still point. Hargrove blinked slightly. The phrase caught his attention. And you use both hands, she finished. And you bring them home. No one spoke for several seconds. Then the class began. Hours passed quickly. Training drills. Field simulations. Controlled chaos. By the time the session ended, the skepticism on Hargrove's face had softened into something else. Respect, perhaps. Or curiosity. As the others filed out, he approached her desk. Ma'am. She looked up. Can I ask something? Yes. He hesitated for a moment. Then asked directly. Is it true you made a 1,180-meter shot on that mission last spring? She didn't react immediately. Where did you hear that? Kowalski spoke at a training seminar last month. That made sense. Kowalski didn't exaggerate stories. Which meant if he had mentioned it, he had done so carefully. Tessa nodded once. Yes. Hargrove was quiet for a moment, trying to reconcile something in his mind. Then he asked the same question Kowalski had asked months earlier. You're a SEAL medic. The words landed differently now. No smirk. No judgment. Just curiosity. Tessa met his gaze. Corpsman, she said. IDC certified. Hargrove nodded slowly. He picked up his notebook. Thank you, ma'am. And then he left the room. But later that evening, as the sun dipped into the Pacific and the sky turned deep purple above the water, Tessa sat alone outside her quarters, her phone in her hand, the number already dialed, waiting, because some battles end in forests, and some begin with a single phone call. Why did her hands feel steadier in a firefight than they did holding a phone? Tessa Cole sat on the concrete step outside her quarters and stared at the Pacific as the evening light faded into shades of blue and purple. The ocean moved the way it always moved, slow, patient, indifferent to whatever small human battles were happening along its shore. The phone rested in her hand. The number was already dialed. All she had to do was press call. For 6 months, she had carried this moment with her. Through training sessions, through long runs along the Coronado beach before sunrise, through quiet nights when the base settled into silence and the memory of that firefight returned like a distant echo. The promise had been broken, not carelessly, not accidentally, but deliberately. And her mother deserved to hear it from her, not from rumors, not from some official report buried in military paperwork. From her. The ocean wind moved across the water and touched her face. Tessa exhaled slowly. Then she pressed the button. The phone rang once. Twice. On the second ring, her mother answered. Tessa. It wasn't a question. Her mother had always known when it was her somehow, as if daughters carried a frequency that only mothers could hear. Hi, Mom. Her voice sounded steady. At least she hoped it did. There was a small pause on the line. Not worry, just attention. The kind that said I'm here. You okay? Her mother asked. Yes. Another pause. Tessa looked out across the darkening water. I need to tell you something. All right, her mother said quietly. No tension. No alarm. Just readiness. The kind that comes from years of loving someone who walks into dangerous places for a living. Tessa began at the beginning. The mission. The valley. The unexpected convoy. The sniper on the ridge. She described the Barrett rifle lying in the dirt beside Kowalski's shaking hand. The distance. The wind. The moment when everyone had looked at her. I knew what I was doing, she said. But I also knew what it meant. Her mother didn't interrupt. She never had. Tessa continued. She described the first shot. The miss. The second shot. The stillness that followed. Then she told her about the ambush. About Commander Voss lying on the ground with a bullet in his chest. About the 6-minute clock ticking inside her head while she worked to keep his lung from collapsing. She told her everything. The needle. The chest seal. The gunfire coming from the trees. And finally, the pistol in her left hand. The promise breaking in that quiet moment. I knew I was breaking it, Tessa said softly. I didn't pretend I was. The Pacific rolled slowly against the shoreline below. I would do it again. Silence filled the line. Not angry silence. Not shocked silence. Just the quiet space where a person absorbs something heavy. Finally, her mother spoke. Did he live? Yes. How close was it? 6 minutes. Her mother let out a slow breath. Then she said something that surprised Tessa. He taught you well. The words hit deeper than Tessa expected. He did, she said. Another pause. You know what your father would say, don't you? Tessa stared at the horizon, where the last color of sunset was fading. Yes. Say it anyway. Tessa swallowed once. He'd say I did right. Her mother didn't hesitate. He would. The weight in Tessa's chest shifted slightly. Not lighter exactly, but shared. You were never meant to be just one thing, her mother continued. You were his daughter. The ocean breeze moved softly across the phone. I asked you not to carry a gun because I was afraid, her mother said. I know that. And I was right to be afraid. Tessa didn't argue. Grief had its own logic. But you didn't pick up that gun because you wanted to, her mother continued. You picked it up because someone needed you to. A long pause passed between them. Then her mother said quietly, That's who your father was too. The sound of waves filled the silence for a moment. How's the truck? Tessa asked gently. Her mother laughed softly. You mean the old Ford your father refused to sell for 20 years? That one. It still runs, she said. Mostly. They talked for another 15 minutes. About ordinary things. The weather in Montana. A book her mother was reading. The stubborn behavior of a neighbor's dog. The kind of simple conversation that only exists between people who have known each other for a lifetime. When the call ended, Tessa remained on the step for a while longer. The night had fully settled over the ocean now. Lights from ships blinked faintly along the horizon. For the first time in months, the promise didn't feel broken. It felt understood. Inside her quarters the next morning, a new briefing waited on her desk. Standard format. Clean lines. Mission parameters and logistics. She read it once. Then again. At the bottom of the page under Team Configuration, 2 names appeared. Position 1, Commander Harlan Voss. Position 2, Integrated Medical Support, Tessa Cole. She read the line twice. A faint smile touched her face. Voss had kept his word. Outside her window, the base was already awake. Boots on pavement. Orders echoing across training grounds. The organized motion of a place built for people who move toward difficult things. Tessa picked up her medical kit. She opened it carefully. Tourniquet, chest seals, IV supplies. Everything exactly where it belonged. Preparation wasn't just habit. It was respect. For the work. For the people who might depend on it. She zipped the bag closed and slung it over her shoulder. As she stepped outside, the morning air carried the faint smell of salt from the Pacific. Across the base, trainees moved between buildings, their voices low but determined. Among them was Colt Hargrove. He had arrived early again. Notebook open on his desk. At the top of the page, 4 words were written carefully and underlined twice. Drag them out alive. He was beginning to understand what they meant. And somewhere across the country, Commander Voss sat in a quiet office in Washington. 4 weeks out of surgery. A thin scar running across his chest where the bullet had entered. A room full of officials listened as he spoke. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. Just clearly. About a corpsman who had done something unusual during a mission in April. About the moment when medicine and combat had become the same task. About why the system needed to change. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't decorate the story. He simply told them what had happened. And sometimes truth, spoken plainly, is powerful enough. Back in Coronado, Tessa stepped into the morning sunlight and walked toward the training facility. Her scar caught the light briefly as she adjusted the strap of her pack. Her father had once told her something the night before his last deployment. Standing in the driveway beside that old Ford truck. The most important thing you'll ever learn, he said, is what your hands are for. For 16 years, she had been learning the answer. What they could hold. What they could heal. And sometimes, what they had to protect. Because life wasn't divided into simple roles. Not healer. Not fighter. Something more complicated. Something whole. And somewhere beyond the horizon, another mission was already beginning to take shape. But before she stepped into that future, one more moment still waited. A moment she didn't know was coming. A moment when Commander Voss himself would stand in front of her again. And finally reveal the truth about the night she saved his life. Why did the room fall silent the moment Commander Harlan Voss walked in? Tessa Cole noticed it before she even turned around. The classroom had been loud only seconds earlier. 14 trainees packing gear, chairs scraping against the floor, voices overlapping as they compared notes from the morning exercise. Then the noise faded. Not suddenly. Gradually. Like wind dying down across open water. Tessa finished writing the final instruction on the whiteboard before she turned. Tourniquet placement under stress. She capped the marker and faced the room. And that's when she saw him. Commander Harlan Voss stood quietly in the open doorway. 6 months earlier, he had been lying in frozen dirt with a collapsed lung and 6 minutes left to live. Now he looked stronger again, though not unchanged. His posture was the same, straight, steady, the posture of someone who had carried command for decades. But the scar was visible above the collar of his shirt. A thin, pale line disappearing beneath the fabric. Evidence of the night she had held his life together with her hands. The trainees noticed him too. Some recognized the name immediately. Others only understood from the way the room's energy shifted that someone important had entered. Tessa studied him for a moment. "You're walking," she said simply. Voss smiled faintly. Doctors recommended it. A few quiet laughs moved through the class. But the room stayed attentive, because everyone sensed something else was happening here. Something personal. Voss stepped inside and looked around the classroom slowly. 14 young faces. Eager, curious, still early in their careers. Then his eyes returned to Tessa. "Mind if I borrow your class for a minute?" She gestured toward the floor. "They're yours." Voss stepped forward, resting one hand briefly on the edge of her desk. For a moment he didn't speak. He studied the trainees the same way he studied terrain during missions, carefully, patiently. Finally he said, "6 months ago I made a mistake." The room grew even quieter. "Not the kind you fix with better planning," he continued. "The kind that happens inside your own head." He glanced briefly at Tessa, then back to the class. "I decided I knew what someone was capable of before I'd actually seen them work." A few trainees shifted slightly. They knew that feeling. Everyone had judged someone too quickly at some point. "I thought experience looked a certain way," Voss continued. "Sounded a certain way, moved a certain way." His voice remained calm. "But experience doesn't care about your expectations." He stepped closer to the center of the room. "On a mission last April, I got shot." Several trainees leaned forward instinctively. "Bullet entered here," he said, touching his chest lightly. "Collapsed my lung, filled the cavity with blood." He let that settle for a moment. 6 minutes before respiratory failure. Then he gestured toward Tessa. She fixed it. The room shifted. They had heard rumors about the mission, but hearing it directly from the man who survived it carried a different weight. Voss continued. "She inserted a decompression needle under direct fire." He paused, with an injured hand. Now several trainees glanced at Tessa with wide eyes. "She sealed the wound," Voss said. "Stabilized my breathing." Another pause. "And then she picked up a pistol and kept the rest of the team alive long enough for the helicopter to reach us." The room stayed silent. No one joked. No one whispered. Because suddenly the phrase written on the board meant something different. "Drag them out alive." Voss looked back at Tessa. "You broke a promise that night, didn't you?" She didn't look surprised that he knew. "Yes." The trainees glanced between them. Voss nodded slowly. "And you still believe it was the right decision?" "Yes." He smiled faintly again. "Good." That answer seemed to satisfy him. He turned back to the class. "You'll all face moments like that someday." His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had lived through many of them. Moments where the rulebook stops being helpful. He tapped the board lightly where Tessa's 4 words were written. "In those moments, the mission simplifies." He looked directly at the trainees. "Keep people alive. Nothing else. Not pride. Not ego. Not reputation. Just the job." After a moment, he stepped back toward the door. Then he stopped. "Actually, one more thing." The room waited. Voss looked at Tessa again. "In Washington last month," he said, "I testified before a defense committee." Her eyebrow lifted slightly. "I remember the call." He nodded. "I recommended a structural change." He turned back to the trainees. "Starting next year, integrated combat medicine becomes standard doctrine for Tier 1 support units." A murmur spread through the room. It wasn't loud, but it carried surprise. Training programs didn't change quickly. Policies took years. But Voss wasn't finished. "The doctrine is based on one case study." He paused. Then he said clearly, Tessa Cole. The room went completely silent. Tessa didn't react immediately. Recognition had never been her goal. But Voss wasn't finished yet. I told them something else too, he said quietly. That the most dangerous mistake any commander can make is deciding what someone can't do before they've actually seen them try. He nodded once toward the trainees. Learn that early. Then he looked at Tessa. Walk with me. They stepped outside the building together. The morning air was cool, and the Pacific wind carried the distant sound of waves. For a few seconds, they simply stood there. Finally, Tessa said, "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." He leaned lightly against the railing. "You saved my life. That was my job. That wasn't the part I meant." She looked at him. "The part I meant," Voss continued, "was that you forced me to rethink something I'd believed for 30 years. He gestured toward the base beyond them. Sometimes the hardest missions aren't the ones in the field. Tessa nodded slowly. I've noticed. He studied her for a moment. Your mother understand what happened? Yes. And she said my father would have approved. Voss smiled. Sounds like a wise woman. For a moment they both watched the ocean. The horizon stretched endlessly west. Another mission's coming, Voss said eventually. I saw the briefing. You're on the team. I saw that too. He nodded once. Good. Then he turned and began walking toward the parking area. After a few steps he paused. One last thing, Cole. She looked over. The next time someone asks if you're a SEAL medic. He smiled slightly. What will you say? Tessa thought about the question for a moment. Then she answered the same way she always had. Corpsman. IDC certified. Voss laughed quietly. Fair enough. He continued walking across the base until the morning crowd swallowed him. Tessa stood there a moment longer. Across the courtyard, trainees moved between buildings. Helicopters crossed the sky overhead. Life continuing exactly the way it always did. But some mornings carry a different feeling than others. Some mornings close a chapter, and others quietly begin a new one. Tessa adjusted the strap of her pack and started walking toward the training facility again. Her scar caught the sunlight briefly. Her father had once told her something simple. The most important thing you'll ever learn is what your hands are for. Now she knew. They were for healing, for protecting, for holding someone's life together when everything else was falling apart. And sometimes, when the moment demanded it, they were for both at the same time. Because strength doesn't always speak loudly. Sometimes it moves quietly through the world, doing the work, saving the life, and walking forward without asking for recognition. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.